Hello, everyone. Welcome to Assimilation and Identity, Omniculturalism, Multiculturalism, and the Iranian Diaspora. My name is Nima Majidi, and I am an alumnus of the Georgetown Persian Studies program, and I help Professor Mustafi as well as the Jalinous Lecture Series with the administration of these webinars. If you would like to pose a question during the course of the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so that we can address that question during the designated Q&A time. Questions are welcome in Persian, in English, and in everything in between. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome the founder and director of the Georgetown Persian Studies program, Dr. Farima Mustafi.
خانم ها آقایان روز بخیر شب بخیر. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to the first Jalinous lecture series in 2025. Today's program is titled Assimilation and Identity, Multiculturalism, Omniculturalism, and the Iranian Diaspora. We really appreciate your presence today and your interest in our cultural events. We are planning to have more events this semester, and you can expect to receive more information about this soon. I would also like to extend our gratitude to Shahrzad and Farhad Jalinous. Without their help, these important cultural events would not be taking place. Now I'm pleased to present you our distinguished panelists, Dr. Fatali Moghadam, Professor of Psychology at Georgetown University and Director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Cognitive Science, and Mrs. Tara Bahram. Tara Bahrampour is a journalist and writer who spent 2 decades at the Washington Post covering topics such as aging, demography, immigration, education, and war. She has also written for publications including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Travel and Leisure, and O. And she is the author of the memoir To See and See Again, A Life in Iran and America. She has taught journalism at New York University and the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs in Tbilisi, Georgia. She is now managing editor of Washington History Magazine and the fellowship coach at the Op-Ed Project. I turn to you, dear Mrs. Bahrampour, and thank you all for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor Mustafi, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm so pleased to be speaking with Dr. Fatali Moghadam today. It's such a pleasure. He's an accomplished author, and his latest book is the focus of our topic today, which is The Psychology of Multiculturalism, Assimilation, and Omniculturalism, Managing Diversity in a Global Context. So I know a lot of us are excited to hear more about omniculturalism, and I'm going to dive right into that with you, Professor Moghadam. I'm going to ask you to define this term omniculturalism. I'm going to ask you to define it in the context of your own history and background and your very interesting childhood and youth, basically being bounced around many cultures. So if you could tell us that and sort of help us understand how you came up with this concept of omniculturalism through your own experiences.
First, thank you very much.
Hold on, I'm sorry, 1 second. There seem to be 2 microphones on and there's a huge echo. Maybe we could turn one of them off. There we go, okay.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and particularly delighted because I'm always eager to participate in the Persian Studies program at Georgetown. I think my upbringing and experiences are typical of that of many Iranians who have been over the last half a century forced to take action to move and find a new home in these times. I was born in Iran, and my family left Iran when I was about 8. And for some time we lived in England. My family circumstances were such, because of my father's early death, I was placed in a boarding school in London. And so I was there until I went to university. And around 1979, I was studying intergroup conflict, and I was doing experimental work when the revolution in Iran took place. And this presented to me an enormous opportunity to go and study conflict and change in the real life setting. So I went back, like many people who were in the West at that time, many Iranians. I was eager to contribute to perhaps a more open society. That's what we were hoping for. And I went back. I was in Iran for about 5 years with the revolution and after. And it was a struggle. Those who were there at that time know what I mean. During the hostage taking, during the years of the Iran-Iraq War, those were very difficult years. And I learned a lot. I would say I learned a great deal, both about the psychology of people in these very difficult conditions, and also about culture and the retention of culture and changing culture. We have to remember that revolution is about change and bringing about change. And I was studying how change takes place and how it doesn't take place. In early 1984, I went to Canada because of the conditions in Iran. I could not work there anymore. So I went to McGill University in Canada, and I was there during the 80s until 1990. And of course, Canada is the original home of multiculturalism. It is the first country to establish multiculturalism as an official government policy. And while I was at McGill, I was studying, researching the psychology of multiculturalism, and finding that multiculturalism doesn't seem to work in the way it is intended. I had an opportunity to meet at that time with Pierre Trudeau, who introduced multiculturalism to Canada. Of course, Pierre Trudeau is the father of the current Prime Minister in Canada. And together with several senior professors, I was junior at that time, I met with Trudeau, and we discussed our research on multiculturalism and his intentions when he had introduced multiculturalism as a policy. And by the time I left Canada in 1990, it was very cold. That's part of why I left. We came down to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and by the time I left Canada, I had become quite skeptical of multiculturalism, having researched it psychologically and found that it was problematic. So
tell me about those problems.
There are a number of major problems with multiculturalism, the way it is practiced. First of all, at the heart of multiculturalism, it's what is called the multiculturalism hypothesis, which proposes that if we help groups to become confident and to have pride in their heritage, then they will be open and accepting towards outgroups. Now, this seems like a very benign liberal policy, but when we look at psychological research on the relationship between your own identity, your confidence, your pride, and your acceptance of outgroups, we find that that relationship is problematic. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And we can find many historical examples. The current regime in Iran, the Hezbollah, go back in history, the Nazis, they were very confident in their heritage and they had pride in their group, but they were not particularly accepting towards others. So we can find problems there, but there's also a major problem, I think, in the way that multiculturalism encourages us to celebrate differences. My research in Canada, in the United States, has shown very clearly that at the intergroup level and at the interpersonal level, but I'm talking now at the intergroup level, we are attracted to other groups that we see to be more similar to ourselves. So if I look around and I see groups that are more similar to me, I'm more attracted to them. I want to interact with them. I want to marry into their families. That's what my research is showing. On the other hand, we're telling people we should celebrate differences. We should celebrate how we are different from others. What is that doing when we know psychologically we're attracted to similar others, but at the same time, multiculturalism is telling us to celebrate differences? I think there's a major problem here. And I can later on talk about the link between this kind of policy of celebrating differences and political processes.
I would love to get to that. Before we do, I would like to now hear your alternative and have you talk a little bit about omniculturalism and what, could we do better?
Omniculturalism, yes, thank you. The term omni means all. And the idea of omniculturalism is that instead of celebrating differences between groups, we should celebrate similarities. We should celebrate our humanity. We should celebrate how all humans are very, very similar. We are much more similar than we are different. Whether you take this biologically, genetically, or whether you think about it psychologically, whether you think about it socially, we humans are very, very similar to one another. That's what enables me to go to countries where I don't speak the language, I've never been there, and yet I can communicate with people and understand them, they can understand me, and we can get along. Let me take another example. If you go back to the 19th century, you'll find scientific, so-called scientific books that say women are very different from men. Women should not be in higher education because their brains are built differently and they can't take the pressure. There was a time when the differences between men and women were exaggerated and completely incorrect. If you look at the reality, women and men are very similar in many, many ways. That's why women can compete with men in higher education. They can compete with men in many ways. And so my main point is that when we come out and exaggerate differences, we fabricate differences, we get to a situation where we're encouraging children to construct their family histories, to look for differences, and they end up manufacturing all kinds of differences. And I think this has problems, many problems at the societal level.
I like that you brought up women, because I know that you had talked about the women's movement being a particularly successful movement because of how the women framed it, and that they were framing it differently from the way that minorities might frame movements now. And I'm wondering if you can talk about those differences.
Yes, I think that is a very important point. Minorities, the major ones being African American and Hispanic. Of course, Iranians, we don't qualify as those kinds of minorities. We don't qualify, we've never qualified for any kind of affirmative action. The major groups of minorities, there's now about 60 million odd Hispanics and about 50 million African Americans. They have been encouraged to celebrate their differences, to seek their own path. I think that's a huge mistake. Politically, psychologically, it is a huge mistake. And I go back to the women's movement, which I believe has been the most successful collective movement of the last few centuries. The women's movement, how did women succeed? In 1920, they succeeded to get the vote in the United States. More recently, they've caught up and in some ways overtaken men in higher education. How did they do that? They did not say, we're different from men, we want to be treated differently, we want to be on a different track. They said, we can compete head on with men, we have the same abilities, we can do this. And that was part of their success. I think that is a very important lesson to learn from the women's movement.
I do too. And I'm curious whether you see a reflection of that in recent events in Iran and the women life freedom movement, and the fact that that got so big compared to other movements that we've seen there in the last 4 decades.
The women's movement in Iran has been successful exactly along this path, and those opposed to the women's movement have supported the celebration of differences. There's a reason why Ahmadinejad had a celebration of multiculturalism in Tehran. There's a reason why the mullahs are pushing this idea that women and men have to be treated separately and differently. The women's movement in Iran has succeeded on the basis of the idea that women can and should compete on an equal footing and should be treated in the same way. They should have the same rights. That's the key point. And of course, the opposition is doing exactly what we would expect. They're saying, no, you're different. We're celebrating the differences, and we want multiculturalism in that sense.
Right. And it's interesting because I think it goes against a lot of common wisdom to think of multiculturalism as limiting people rather than opening doors for them.
That's an excellent point. Multiculturalism has opened doors for a small number of elite within each minority group. That small number of elite within each minority group has done very well, but the rest of the minority have not done well at all. You can see this in institutions, organizations, in places where you have that elite well represented at the top, and then there's the rest who don't do well.
I want to stick with that point for a minute because I think that's a nice segue into talking about the Iranian diaspora, who is a minority or immigrant group who has done exceptionally well. And I'm curious about why you think that is. Like, what is different about Iranians in the diaspora, compared to other groups who have moved and migrated?
Yes, Iranians outside Iran have done extremely well. It's difficult to get accurate estimates of how many Iranians are outside Iran. My estimate is about 5 to 6 million. And it could go up to 7, but I think it's around not much bigger than 6. Now, why have they done so well? Because we know, go to any corporation, go to any hospital, go to any university, you will find Iranians well represented and doing extremely well. And particularly, Iranian women have done extraordinarily well. They have done, in some ways, better than the men. Now, why is that? Well, I think there are several factors. One is that most of the Iranians who reach the West particularly come from a middle or upper class background, and they come from values that endorse education, discipline, and hard work. So that's already there. Another factor is that women from Iran have done extraordinarily well because they're so driven, because they see the outside world as an opportunity to demonstrate what they can do. I'm always impressed when I have students who are from Iran or from the Middle East who are female. They tend to be very driven because of the opportunities they see in the West. And of course, because they've had to go through filters to get here.
Absolutely. Do you feel like the idea of kind of putting their heads up culturally as a minority was maybe something that didn't happen so much for Iranians because of the circumstances under which they came here and during the hostage crisis when it was not okay to be Iranian in a lot of circles in the US? And so this idea of sort of like keeping your head down and assimilating and not being different maybe ultimately was helpful to them?
Iranians have had a very challenging time abroad, in part because of hostage taking, in part because of the extremism that has been exported from Iran. And there's always been this struggle for Iranians how to present themselves. I've experienced this, having lived in different Western countries. I've certainly experienced this, how to present yourself. However, I think that most Iranians are now confident enough so that they can present themselves as Iranian and to be proud of their language and their activities. It's interesting that when you look around Western countries, the last decade, we have seen a real growth in the number of, first of all, Iranian or Persian studies programs in universities. There's been a tremendous growth over the last decade. All of the major universities are now teaching Farsi and have some kind of Persian studies program. In Europe and in the US and in Canada and in Australia, this is happening. The other thing that's happening is that parallel to this growth in universities, there are associations in cities, in towns, even in small places. Iranians are now confident enough to get together and to announce their presence through cultural organizations. And this was very difficult to do even 30 years ago. The Iranian community has now gained enough confidence to do this. The other trend that I'm noticing is that Iranian children, the children born to Iranian parents, are now shifting to become more confident to speak Farsi and to maintain Farsi. And that's another trend that's happening.
Those are very interesting. And I'm wondering, as Iranians now embrace their identity more, they're still able to not be siloed in this harmful way that you're talking about. So how do you see Iranians figuring out how to take this middle road? Like, why are they able to do this when other groups have had a harder time?
Part of it is that the Iranian community outside Iran is characterizing itself culturally and nationally. And if it is using religion, it is a very moderate form of Islam or other forms of religion. So Iranians outside Iran are not seen as religious radicals. They're not seen as extremists in that sense. And I think Iranians outside Iran have positioned themselves well as being seen as moderates. Now, of course, the regime in Iran is sending extremists, and there's always the danger of these extremists doing harm in different ways. So there's that very difficult balancing act. But because of the success of the Iranian population outside Iran, I think there's a great momentum now in the profile being positive, and it's difficult for that profile to be destroyed no matter how many agents are sent from Iran.
Do you feel like Iranians are particularly well suited to be omniculturalists, if we can use that word? Is there something about the psychology of Iranians that sets them up better for this?
My sense is that Iranians have a cultural background, a very deep cultural background that allows them to be worldly. And this is reflected in our literature. I give a few lines from Sadi in the book, which are translated and present in the United Nations building. But there are so many examples in Iranian literature of our worldliness, of this emphasis on seeing humanity as one. And all of us can remember lines from poetry where this is happening. بنی آدم اعضای یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهرند. چو عضوی به درد آورد روزگار. I'm sure a lot of people could finish this. دیگر عضوها نماند قرار. تو که از مهنت دیگران بی غمی، نشاید که نامت نهند آدمی. Simple translation: all human beings are part of the same body. If you don't feel the pain of others, then you don't deserve to be called a human being. We can find so many examples of this kind of thinking in Iranian culture, in Iranian history, in Iranian literature. So my sense is that Iranians are very worldly by culture. That's why I think they have come out of Iran and done so well, so quickly.
That's fascinating. Speaking of human beings, I would like to now start looking at some questions from the audience and inviting audience members to start asking. And I see we have a few coming in. So I'm going to start with a question about language. What are the linguistic implications of omniculturalism? Must we all speak the same language?
Excellent question. This is a challenging issue because it's a global issue. There's a whole research literature on what is called language death. Language death. Every month, several languages die. When Columbus arrived in North America, there were approximately 15,000 languages in the world. Of those 15,000, approximately 9,000 have already died. There's about 6,000 left, and there are languages dying every month. Some would argue, well, it's good because more and more people will speak the same languages, will have fewer problems in communications. English, of course, has become the scientific language and the business language. But there are other important languages, Mandarin Chinese, for example. So what should we do? Should we move towards one language, or should we emphasize the rights of people speaking minority languages? At one level, we are forced to move to use common languages. If you want to progress in science or business, you have to be able to use English. But the other thing we've learned is that we can be in command of a number of languages. We don't have to use just one language. So it seems to me the way forward is for human beings generally to teach their children multiple languages. And we know from psychological research that bilingualism and trilingualism is better for mental capacity than unilingualism. If you take two groups of children, one group you educate bilingually, the other unilingually, and you control for everything, you will find the bilinguals are going to do better in every way. So Iranians, I think, have naturally taken this up.
And would you say bilingualism or multilingualism is also better for omniculturalism?
Yes, absolutely. Omniculturalism involves not just celebrating our commonalities, but sharing our commonalities. And this comes about better through multilingualism. One of the characteristics of Iranians outside Iran is that they've been forced to take on at least a second language. It's not unusual for them to speak a third or fourth language.
Absolutely. We have another question about the US. And it's a big question. How does the professor explain the move away from multiculturalism and assimilation in the US today? Why the backlash toward the other? If you could put that in the context of our current political moment, I think it would really help people.
Yes, excellent. If we look back to the last presidential election, we saw that the Democratic nominee, Harris, attempted a kind of unifying approach. She did not emphasize ethnicity and differences among groups. Whereas President Trump was the other way. He was emphasizing differences. He was using different strategies to appeal to different groups, sometimes contradicting himself, but he was focusing on differences. I think one of the reasons why Trump won was because the ground was prepared for his tactics. We have already, in the last 30, 40 years, been celebrating differences and exaggerating differences and even creating manufacturing differences where there aren't any. So Trump's message was very much in line with what was already happening. Harris's message was not in line with what was already happening. She was trying to avoid these kinds of differences. So it seems to me there's a direct link between what happened politically and the way we've been celebrating cultures and differences. Unfortunately, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that unfortunately, this has not been to the benefit of minorities at all.
Can you expand on that last point? You know, looking at affirmative action, for example, which you brought up earlier. Has that been to the disadvantage of people who were, you know, part of the affirmative action? I mean, do you feel like that has not been a success?
Yes. Well, first of all, we have to remind ourselves that Iranians outside Iran have not benefited at all from affirmative action in any country that I know. There was some, I've taught also in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and there's some programs there where Iranian students have attempted to take advantage of being different, but very small. In general, Iranians outside Iran have not been the beneficiaries of programs like affirmative action. Now, why do I think affirmative action in the long term does not benefit the minorities in the long term? First of all, affirmative action in the United States, especially in the United States, is not based on economic, financial situation. Like many people who teach at private universities, at Georgetown, I do have minority students, but very, very few of them are economically, financially stressed. Most of them are much more financially better off than I am. So one of the points is that the question is, who is benefiting from affirmative action? I joked that we had the Prince of Spain here as one of our students, and I said, well, he must be affirmative action. You know, he's Hispanic. Affirmative action, if it is going to be beneficial, must be on the basis of financial conditions. Let's help the poor, and this includes poor whites. One of the reasons why the far right in the United States has surged, one of the reasons why populism has surged, is because we have ignored poor whites. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind as we move ahead. We have emphasized affirmative action on the basis of ethnicity. By the way, I avoid the term race. It's just completely inaccurate. We can't categorize African Americans, Hispanics, and so-called whites. They can't be categorized on the basis of race, or it's just not correct. It's ethnicity, it's constructed ethnicity. And what we've done is we have selected people from each of these groups, and they have typically been well-off people. Just because a student is Hispanic or African American and they come to me doesn't mean that they're deprived. In fact, in most cases, they're not deprived at all. What we need is economically deprived people. So affirmative action, if it is going to be working effectively, constructively, it has to be rethought. And as I mentioned, Iranians have never been part of this, really.
So speaking of Iranians, I want to read another question to you and try to kind of work through this. The question is, in my research, I have found multiculturalism among Iranians abroad, particularly in the US, has been instrumental in easing socio-psychological issues of immigration and helpful in advancing assimilation. What are your thoughts on that? And I guess the question is it multiculturalism among Iranians abroad that we're talking about? Or, you know, how would you unpack that? What has been the instrumental?
Yes. I'm looking at multiculturalism as a psychologist. So my interpretation of multiculturalism may be different from what this questioner is asking. At the heart of multiculturalism are a number of psychological assumptions about how we behave in groups. The multiculturalism hypothesis I mentioned, the celebration of differences I mentioned, and I also mentioned the similarity attraction research that contradicts what is happening with the celebration of differences. So I'm looking at it as a psychologist. I can certainly see that individual Iranians who come to the United States and other countries have abandoned Iran, now have to make a new life in order to develop an identity that will be functional, that will work in this new setting. They have to achieve a balance between what they're going to retain from their heritage, culture, and language, and what they're going to take up from the United States and its cultures and language. Obviously, they have to do this in a way that allows them to succeed in their professions, as well as in their personal lives. So this is a balancing act. And in most cases, Iranians have done extremely well in achieving a good balance. And as I mentioned, I think women outside Iran have succeeded extraordinarily well. We can find so many women performing at the highest levels in different professions. And I think this comes back both to identity and their motivation to succeed because of the unique opportunities they now have. So again, I'm not sure what the questioner is asking, is assuming about multiculturalism. My approach to it is as a psychologist.
Thank you. Now, this question is going to challenge my Farsi reading. I hope one day in Iran, all schools teach chess instead of ta'alimat dini, religion.
Yes.
How does a teacher informed of this important distinction between multiculturalism and omniculturalism might change his or her teaching? And I think that's a great question, because I think you talk about that in the book too, about needing to start with the children.
Yes, yes. I wasn't sure if the question about chess is linked to this, but certainly chess has been banned in different ways at different times in places like Iran. And it goes back to the medieval times when chess was seen as evil because it was seen, in part because it was seen as associated with gambling. But now, on this issue of how we teach young children, the proposal in Omniculturalism is that we spend the first 12 years or so teaching children to think of the question, answer the question, what is a human being? It's a very simple question. What is a human being? And the answer is that human beings, whether they're born in Africa, Asia, Europe, America, wherever they're born, they have a common set of characteristics, and science tells us what these characteristics are. And the first 12 years or so should be spent teaching children about our commonalities across ethnic groups, across gender groups. There is so much overlap in our characteristics. Often there are stereotypes that go against the reality of our common characteristics. For example, think about the stereotypes of males and females. How men have been stereotyped as doing one thing, liking one thing, and women quite another. You know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, these kinds of stereotypes. And also stereotypes about men and women and their capabilities. Even in the most recent psychological discussions, people raise this issue that, men are better at than women in quantitative work. Women are superior in verbal ability. Well, let's look at that. In practice, if you look at the overlap, if you draw a distribution of male and female abilities on quantitative and verbal abilities, what you find is that there is enormous overlap in the distributions. In other words, there are very few women who are better than men, all men, in verbal abilities, and very few men who are better than all women in quantitative abilities. So something like 99 point something percent of women and men are on the same distribution in these areas. We often exaggerate the differences between groups. And what we have to teach children is, first of all, what are the commonalities? Then around the age of 12, 13, we start also teaching them about group differences. How women and men, African Americans and whites, etc., have some differences. But we don't make the differences the priority. It becomes secondary. And I
Do
think,
you feel like, oh, go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, please.
Well, when you talk about that, and I think back to, say, the 50s in the US, and when there was this sort of monoculturalism and all the kids were taught the same thing, and everyone read Dick and Jane, and everyone was sort of supposed to look the same and act the same. And then it fractured into many celebrations of many different kinds of people. So again, like, how do you teach children the middle ground between Dick and Jane and, everyone's got their own silo?
Yes. You've pinpointed the problem, really, of achieving a balance. We've now got to a situation where we are in multiple solitudes, where we live side by side in these solitudes, and we keep emphasizing our differences and celebrating our differences, and we fail to notice the commonalities because we are being told by the education system. From childhood, we're being told that we should celebrate our differences. And unfortunately, we know from psychological studies that when we're emphasizing differences, people will begin to manufacture differences. And we also know from psychological studies that it only takes minor differences to start discrimination and conflict. You don't need huge differences. If you focus on differences, even the minor differences will result in conflicts. If you go back even to cases like the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda, minor differences between them, but once you start exaggerating and emphasizing those differences, it can lead to enormous conflict and genocide.
And now on top of that, we have the internet. And so people have more and more of a fractured field from which to draw their realities. So given that, and given the sort of direction that we see society taking, how do you propose we might be able to turn it in a different direction?
It's a challenge how we turn this in a new direction, in a different direction, but we do it in the same way that multiculturalism over the last 50 years became the dominant way of thinking. If you look back from around the 1960s, we've had this shift to the celebration of differences. And I certainly understand politically why it happened. Minorities saw this, or they were told this is the way to get your rights. If you want to become a group that has its rights, then this is what you need to do. You need to march in step with multiculturalism. But my sense is that it has gone too far in the wrong direction. And most people who are members of minorities are no longer benefiting. A very small group within each minority is benefiting, and that group is defending multiculturalism because they get a lot out of it.
Someone asks in relation to Iran, there are a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions in Iran. How do we approach integration? Through omniculturalism or multiculturalism?
I believe it must be through omniculturalism because of a very important reason that relates to what's happening in Iran. One of the reasons why I am against multiculturalism is because multiculturalism endorses relativism. I'm going to explain that. Omniculturalism endorses universalism and universal rights. One of the reasons why, if you look at what's happening in Iran, if you look at why someone like Ahmadinejad celebrated multiculturalism, it is because it allows for relativism. It allows people to say, we treat women in this way because it is our culture, it is our values. You can't tell us what to do. We don't accept your universal human rights. That is a Western concept. We will do it our way, and we treat our women this way, and that's correct for us. That's the argument. And it is a relativist argument, meaning that each group has the right to be judged only within its own culture and only within its own values. We will not be judged according to universal rights because they don't apply to us. Unfortunately, multiculturalism endorses that kind of relativistic thinking, whereas I believe what we must have is universal rights. I believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I believe that that's a beginning, and we must build on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and expand it and strengthen it and apply that to every human being. How does a person qualify to have the rights? They qualify because they're human. Just because they are human, they qualify for the human rights. And this is something that is rejected by the mullahs, it is rejected by relativists, and it is rejected by the multiculturalists if you think through what they're asking.
So I have a follow-up question to that, which is, we see how it's not going well in many societies. We see authoritarianism and, kind of dictatorship and concentration of power among the wealthy. Do you see anywhere in the world, either any nation or any culture or any subculture, where omniculturalism actually has taken root and is promoted and is working? Are there any models for us?
Well, there are countries that are closer to omniculturalism. I would argue that Scandinavian countries are closer to omniculturalism. I would argue that if you look within countries like the United States, there are certain groups that are closer to omniculturalism, and there are those that are way moving away from omniculturalism. For example, the far right in North America, the far right in Europe is moving away from omniculturalism. If you look at the neo-Nazis in Germany, the neo-Nazis in Austria, these groups are moving away from omniculturalism, but there are other groups, humanist groups, that are arguing for a form of omniculturalism. So it's a fragmented picture around the world. And you're absolutely right to point to those two trends. First of all, the concentration of wealth, and second, the concentration of power, especially shifting to the right. We're going through a phase in human history. These phases come, and I'm sure there will be a swing the other way. And when I say these phases in history, I'm looking now back 3,000 years at least, where, at least in Western history, we can see the collapse of Athens, Athenian democracy, the collapse of Roman Republic, the Florentine and other republics in the Middle Ages. Then we get to the revolutions of the 18th century and the movement gradually towards more democratic states. But we have to remember that the fight to establish democracy is a long-term fight involving thousands of years. And over this century, there's no doubt the struggle will continue, but there will be shifts backwards and forwards. It's never been the case that democracies have won out easily, never. They've always had to fight uphill, because if you look back 10,000 years, our history has been dominated by strongmen, dictatorships, not democracies. Democracies are a sort of minority event in history.
Back to an audience member question. What do you interpret to be the difference between omniculturalism and polyculturalism?
Polyculturalism, I think, was first put forward by historians. And the basic idea is that all cultures, well, they have common roots in that we all began as human beings, and there are these shared aspects to all cultures, which I agree with. What I'm arguing is that instead of talking about differences and where these cultural roots come from, what we need to do is look at the science that tells us what the common human characteristics are. It's a little bit akin to looking at something like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and seeing what are our common rights. What I would like to happen is also have a United Nations Declaration of Human Duties. What are our common duties? Duties, of course, are things that I owe others. Rights are what I am owed. And I think we need to establish this universally and support this universally so that we establish humanity and human rights very clearly for children.
Can you elaborate on what some of those duties might be?
Yes, for example, the right to free speech involves a duty for me to allow you to speak freely to me. I was recently reviewing the statements of some Iranian leaders, especially the supreme leader, that everyone is free to say what they want in Iran. And it's interesting looking at this kind of statement where the duty to allow people to speak, that is not acknowledged. The big problem is when you have a regime that does not allow criticism. Once you have a regime that does not allow criticism, corruption grows. It doesn't matter if that regime calls itself communist, Islamic Republic, even capitalist democracy. If you don't allow criticism, then corruption grows. And so one of our duties as human beings is to allow others to criticize us, to have this kind of open discussion. So somebody can tell me, look, you're wrong on this, which is great. Then we have a discussion. If you don't have that openness, corruption will grow as it has grown in Iran. If you look at the list of the corruption index list of nations, Iran is very close to the bottom. Why is it very close to the bottom? Because people are not allowed to criticize authorities. And once authorities cannot be criticized, corruption increases.
Thank you. Another audience question. In a place like the US, where race and ethnicity-based difference has played a role in violent oppressions, do you think oppressed groups have a different relationship with the idea of celebrating or ignoring difference?
Yes, of course, the particular history of the United States, the tragedy of slavery in the United States, the tragedy of post-slavery society, where minorities continue to be subjugated. All that is highly relevant. My point would be to say that let's not just talk about ethnicity, because there are also a lot of poor whites who we should attend to. If we don't attend to poor whites, we will get far-right movements. We will get populist authoritarian leaders like Donald Trump, and they will be supported particularly by poor whites, particularly by low-educated males. And the same is true when we go to Iran. If you look at the profile of something like the Basij in Iran, if the Basij members were here, they would have been part of the January 6th insurrection. And if the January 6th criminals were in Iran, they would be part of the Basij. You have to attend to these people, otherwise you will get this criminal fringe. And of course, they are much more widely supported in Iran.
And you specified males just now. Is this are males more prone to falling into this kind of thing? And if so, why?
Yes. Oh, there's no doubt. Males are more prone to fall into this kind of thing for a number of reasons. First of all, males are far higher on aggression than females. Second, the profile of the authoritarian personality that fits this type of male involves hitting down on minorities, particularly women, and being fearful of women who are talented and professional and educated. So these far-right regimes, including the mullahs in Iran, when they want to mobilize, they will appeal to the low education male, the authoritarian male, as will the far right in the United States and in Western Europe. They will appeal to that type of male because they can use the aggression of that male to hit at any kind of disapproval, particularly women.
Okay, another audience member asks, how can we encourage omniculturalism in the society? And please give some examples: families, schools, cultural associations, political parties. So what can we do personally to try to turn the tide?
First of all, we can raise our children, and this is very important within the family. We can raise our children by first encouraging the idea that human beings, Bani Adam, all of us have certain common characteristics, rights, and duties. So that is a first thing of teaching our own children about being a human being. And I think it just comes naturally from Iranian culture. Second, we have to change the emphasis in schools. In schools at the moment, young children are being given exercises such as go home, interview your parents and grandparents and whoever's around, find out the traditions in your family and how they're different from other traditions. I've seen children go and interview the grandmother or grandfather or the parents and ask, well, what's different about us? And then they have to start making things up. They have to fabricate things. Why not ask the child to go back and see how there are similarities. The similarities are much greater. So this has to change over time in schools, in families, also in cultural organizations, where they don't just emphasize, oh, look how our food is different. Look at how we dress differently. Remember, these differences are fairly shallow. I love going to Persian restaurants, and I've been to all the ones around DC, and every single one of them has usually more non-Iranians than Iranians customers. Of course, we all enjoy the same kinds of food. We all love good food. So don't keep emphasizing how we're different. Also emphasize how actually Persian food is loved by everybody. It's our commonalities that need emphasis.
So are there any exercises or assignments or particular messages that we can give children that are different from those other messages?
Yes, the very simple one is what I started with omniculturalism, asking what are the basic characteristics of human beings? What is a human being? And it seems to me we come back to things like human beings are moral beings. We think about good and bad. We think about how we should behave, how we should not behave. And these are very common. These are very common. We all agree on basic things. That's how we can travel and get on with people, even when we don't speak their language, even though we really know nothing about the local conditions, we can live there. Iranians, if you look at Iranians outside Iran, they have gone now to just about every country on earth. I've done a lot of international research, and wherever I go, I always look up Iranian restaurants. And I'm amazed. Wherever I've gone, I found the Iranian restaurant. And I found Iranians, and I found them living with these people who, on the surface, look so different. But yet there they are.
Do you feel like maybe growing up in Iran helps prepare people for that, in the sense that there are so many different ethnicities, religions, and so on in Iran, and yet Iranians all feel very strongly to be Iranian? You think there's something in that where they're able to bring that understanding out when they go into the world?
That's a very good point. Iran is a highly complex, multi-ethnic, multi-language, multi-religion society. Unfortunately, the central government has tried to enforce their own particular brand of extremist, fundamentalist Islam on everyone. But if you look at how people function, they function within the multiplicity of ethnicities and languages and religions, and they do still very well. Corruption has increased, but that's not the fault of the people there. It's the fault of the regime. It's an inevitable outcome of a dictatorial regime that does not allow criticism of authorities.
So we have a question, which I'll expand. The question is, when will the book be translated into French? And so I should ask if there are any other languages as well.
The book has just come out, so I really don't know. It takes some time. I've just heard that my book on the psychology of revolution is being translated into Bengali, but this has taken 2 years. So it does take some time, and before people get to know about this kind of thing.
And I should also ask, do you know of any colleagues in Iran who are teaching anything along the same lines or writing along the same lines?
I don't know, but I'm sure, there are colleagues there doing similar kind of thinking. The challenge, of course, is much, much greater in Iran. Having worked in Iran after the revolution, I am always in admiration of people who work there right now, because they are working under tremendous pressure, under terrible restrictions and terrible threats. So it is a very different situation.
Absolutely. I have a question about the moment we're living in terms of climate change and migration, because we're facing a century really that's sort of unprecedented in the terms of, masses of people who are going to be moving around the world, whether it's for political reasons, climate, combination of all of it. Where do you foresee us going in terms of trends along the lines of, multiculturalism or conflict versus, embracing omniculturalism? I mean, do you see sort of any paths in the forest that you're able to sort of translate or discern for us from this vantage point?
Well, looking to the future, we have to take notice of demography. Demographic trends are very important. If you look at Europe and North America, the same is true of Russia, the same is true of China, Japan. All these parts of the world are having too few babies. You need a growth of 2.1% every year in order to maintain your population. Europe at the moment has got something like an average of 1.5%. Russia is well below that, and they're losing population. China is losing population. North America has always dealt with this issue, this challenge, by importing labor, by importing immigrants like us. But the reason we're having problems or debates, complex debates about immigration, is because historically, the immigrants who came to North America were mostly Christian and white. And remember what I said about similarity attraction research. If you look at the post-war period, this trend of immigrants being mostly white and Christian has changed dramatically. Why? Because the countries where they used to come from, like Russia, like Europe, coming to the United States, those countries don't have a surplus of babies. They have too few babies, so they need immigrants themselves. Where are the places where there is a surplus of babies? Africa, some parts of Asia, the Middle East. So the people who are coming to North America, coming to Europe, available to be immigrants, they are dissimilar to the native population. For example, Middle Eastern Muslims, 1 million going to Germany in 1 year. Now that is the new trend in immigration, and it's leading to backlash. because when you have 1 million Middle Eastern Muslims moving to Germany in 1 year, the local population feels threatened because there are all these dissimilar others arriving. And remember, the people leaving places like Syria were not middle and upper class. They did not have the kind of value system that allowed them to click into the education sector in Europe and North America. So looking ahead, one of the big challenges is that immigration patterns have been changing because of demography. And because of demography, you have individuals like Donald Trump able to take advantage of the threats people feel. Remember that much of Trump's propaganda is designed to make you feel threatened. Feel fear. Why? Because he tells us there are all these gangsters coming over the border. They're coming to kill and maim and rape. That's what he's telling us. And he keeps pointing to the same thing. This trend, the new immigration trend, is going to lead to backlash. It's had backlash in Europe. It's had backlash in North America. In Russia, in China, they haven't really grappled with this problem because they haven't imported immigrants. In Japan, they're trying to deal with this problem in a different way by using robotics, by extending the working life, all kinds of strategies so they could import fewer immigrants because they can see it as a problem.
Interesting. This has been so interesting, and unfortunately, we only have a couple more minutes left. So in the time we have, I wanted to just ask you, where are you going next? You know, what are your future research interests, and what can we look forward to from you?
Thank you. I've just finished a book on collective irrationality.
That sounds
And
interesting.
of course, we know there's a lot of cognitive research on individual people being irrational. And of course, all Freud's work was on that. But I'm interested in collective irrationality.
Can
For
you give an example of that?
Well, it involves cases where people move as a collective to do the wrong thing, and they're not aware of why they're doing it. For example, I've analyzed the 2007-2008 financial crisis, where very large numbers of people bought houses they could not afford, took out bank loans they could not afford, until they kept doing this. Some of them bought 4 or 5 houses until the system collapsed. And then their houses were worth much less than they had borrowed, and they were underwater, and they had to abandon everything. They lost everything they put in. That's an example of collective irrationality. And what I've done is analyze collective irrationality and explained why it happens. So that's one of my projects. And I'm also working on what I call banal authoritarianism and banal extremism. This is where extremism and authoritarianism becomes part of our daily life, and we're not aware of that happening, but we start using the language, the terminology, the symbols of extremism. An example is using the Hitler salute and then saying, well, it was just nothing, don't pay attention to those things. So there are examples of this creeping into our lives and becoming part of our everyday experiences. And we're not really aware of this. We're just taking part in a performance, and before we know it, we have become extremists ourselves in our language and practices.
Wow, that sounds so timely and so interesting, and I can't wait to hear more about it.
Thank you.
Professor Moghadam, thank you so much. Yeah, this has been such a wonderful discussion, and we're just so grateful to have had this time with you.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the questions, and I learned from them. I wish everybody a good weekend, and the good news is that spring, Bahar, is almost here. So we'll have flowers and sunshine and good weather very soon for Eid.
I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bahrampour and Dr. Moghadam. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to your conversation, as I'm sure our audience did as well. Just as a reminder, this event was recorded, and this recording will be available on the Georgetown Persian Studies Program website very soon. On behalf of Professor Mustafi and the Georgetown Persian Studies Program, I would like to thank all of you for your time and for your questions, and hope that you will join us for future webinars and future iterations of the lecture series. Thank you all once again. خیلی ممنون برای همه چی و امیدوارم که همه‌تون روز خیلی خوبی داشته باشین. خدا نگهدار. Bye bye.